right, so it says I am live. I came on live a little bit early so that I can check a few things. Okay, that seems to be working. That seems to be working. I'm bringing my live video up on Facebook so that I can see the comments as I'm looking at the screen and that screen. So yay. Okay. Hey, Elizabeth. All right, so I have the book. If y'all want to read it with me, I have the link here. Let me. There you go. So I have the link right here. If you would like to go get it, it's 99 cents right now. It's on sale until Sunday. And yeah. All right. How are you doing? We were painting last week, so that was fun. By last week, I mean this past weekend. All right, so I'm going to switch over to the spoiler alert banner because if you haven't read this book yet, there's going to be a lot of spoilers. I'm doing well. I've been struggling with my writing a little bit, but I'm getting there. We were painting the baseboards and door frames of this house. And that was interesting. All right, are you ready to get started? I am nervous. Yes, it was weird. A lot of taping. All right, so we will get started. Let's see. I don't think anyone has joined us in Facebook yet. And no one in Discord. All right. So these chapters have weird titles, and I'll read them out to you, and you'll understand once we get to the chapter itself. Chapter 1. She turned to the others when they left the portrait hall. She's remembering the lost princess. It was a long hallway filled with large family portraits and expensive furniture. Long red curtains bracketed the tall windows, letting light through to brighten the dark walls. The room held a bit of chill, even with the sun, due to all of the portraits in the hall. Some of the portraits looked dour, but most of the portraits showed happily smiling people. A young lady, still a teen, walked down the hall looking at each portrait. These were her family members. There was her dad's great-grandmother. The woman's husband's portrait was next to hers. That was her grandmother's, King Julius's mother, portrait just a few feet away. The teen stepped over to a portrait of her grandmother, her dress swishing behind her. The tiara shined on her head of dark curls, styled as such by her personal hairstylist. The princess, for that's what she was, touched the frame of her father's mother. The woman had died when King Julius's eldest son, Frederick, was a baby. The princess got lost in thought, thinking about her childhood. When she was 5, her mother was pregnant with twins. Of course, no one knew that there was a second baby. The teen frowned as she thought about the jealousy she felt about the new baby, and how, when the second baby, a girl, was stillborn, she felt she was being punished. She sighed, thinking that life was so not fair. She had withdrawn a bit at that point, and then she started acting like she didn't have to do anything that she didn't want to. She laughed at the childish view she had had on life, thinking that everything will be better if you just wish it to happen. If that was true, her little sister would be alive now. The princess felt guilty about the death of her little sister, and no one understood that she felt guilty because she never talked about it. How could she bear telling her family about her feelings? A noise had her looking up, but it was just a couple of maids that were doing their chores and other assignments. She noticed that they stopped when they saw her. "Princess Katerina," one said, "do you need anything?" "No," Katerina replied. They curtsied and went on their way, leaving her to her thoughts. She watched as they left, and then went back to staring at the portraits. She still couldn't believe how much her life had changed since she was 5. At just 16 years old, she had wallowed in self-pity and self-hatred, each battling for dominance, for 11 years. She walked further down the hall to a family portrait taken just 6 years ago. In the portrait, her father, King Julius, stood proud and strong behind the sitting figure of her lovely mother, Queen Lani. Katerina's oldest brother, Frederick, then 16, was standing on the king's left, showing that he was the crown prince. George, aged 14 in the portrait, stood opposite Frederick on the king's right. Katerina herself had stood on her mother's left, with her 7-year-old brother Thomas beside her. Then there was Derek. He was standing on Queen Lani's right, but the absence of the little girl next to him brought tears to Katerina's eyes. Discreetly, she wiped her eyes, trying so hard not to cry. In Queen Lani's arms was a little bundle in blue cloth, Katerina's baby brother, Blake. The family looked so happy in the portrait, but you could see a haunted look in some of their eyes. Katerina sat down on the closest cushioned lounge in the hall. She just sat there, thinking about what had happened over the last few years. She tried to bring up the first instance of when she changed, and realized that it was when her little sister died. When Katerina was 5, she had been bratty and jealous of her mom's pregnancy. She had said something horrible, like she didn't want another younger sibling or something like that. Katerina couldn't quite remember, but she did remember the shock and horror she felt when Derek was born and Rose wasn't. Katerina felt like a murderer when the midwife came out to say that the little princess was born dead. She had killed her own sister with her jealousy. Katerina didn't even notice the tears slide down her cheeks as she continued to stare at the portrait. More maids and other servants came into the hall, but ran back out when they saw her crying. They didn't want to get on her bad side by interrupting her when she was crying. Then one maid saw what Katerina was staring at and understood. She turned to the others when they left the portrait hall. She's remembering the lost princess. That's what they called Rose, because she was stillborn. The other staff members nodded in understanding and went on their way. Katerina also remembered how she would withdraw from everyone for long periods of time. She remembered the temper she had developed over time and how others reacted to her temper. She was a bit ashamed over losing her temper at people, but she didn't think she could change now. It was too late for her to change. This is who she was now. She was spoiled, stubborn, hard-headed, jealous at times, and a little rude when she thought someone was being particularly obtuse. She knew the rumors about her. She knew that people thought she was obnoxious. But what could she do about it? Nothing, that's what. When a tear hit her hand, Katerina looked down. "Oh," she said in a shocked voice. She pulled out a handkerchief and wiped the tears from her face. She stood and turned to one of the windows in the room. She hoped that no one saw her crying. That would probably have them think that she was overreacting or a crybaby. Either way, she did not want to be seen crying. Not now, not ever. In an office with a large oak desk, 3 men sat or stood talking. The dark, wood-paneled walls, tall windows, long red curtains that pulled on the floor, and a large rug showed what type of king ruled the land. He was a stately man, a kind and just king that had a very commanding presence. His dark hair was styled back in a very short ponytail at the base of his neck. His eyebrows were neatly trimmed. His piercing blue eyes hid a kind, laughing side. But he also had scars on his soul that he felt no one would understand. He gathered up papers about a contract and looked up at his advisors. The 2 men in front of him were as different as night and day. One man was dark-haired and as a chestnut on a tree, with a short and slightly stocky frame. The other was tall and slender, with a fair appearance. The 3 men were discussing a contract, something that could bankrupt the country if it wasn't followed through. "Let's bring my daughter in," the king decided, after a long deliberation. It was time. "Have my lovely wife get her." "Yes, King Julius," the blonde advisor replied, bowing and leaving immediately. His king decides, and he obeys. His family had served the royal family for many generations. The young man hurried to find the queen. He walked through long hallways, looking in the dining hall and the family sitting room. He found her in the sitting room she preferred. It was called the Queen's Sitting Room for a reason. It was a pretty room with hints of pink and gold in the furniture. The room was brightly lit and cheerful. The Queen was just as bright and cheerful. When he made himself known and Queen Lani acknowledged him, he stepped into the room. "Your Majesty, the king would like you to go bring the princess to his study." He knew, and agreed, that it wasn't right for him to go see the princess himself. Of course, Blake. She stood up from the settee, smoothing out her long, dark blue dress. Her long brown hair was swept up in an elaborate updo. Her warm brown eyes were lit with an inner laugh. She walked over to the advisor, a young man that her husband had brought in as an advisor at a younger age than normal, because the young man's father had died too soon. "Thank you, and thank you for your service towards our family." She smiled warmly at him, showing off a small dimple at the right side of her mouth. Her youngest son was named after him, even. That's how much the family appreciated his service. "It's no hardship." His eyes widened. "It was an honor to work for this family." He loved working for them. They treated him like family. When his father had died when he was 18, they took him in, gave him a job, and helped take care of his sickly mother. He smiled and bowed to the queen. Then they parted ways. He went back to the king's study quickly. He was slightly embarrassed about the praise and gratitude from the queen, and when he made it back to the king, he was slightly pink in the cheeks. A storm was brewing inside, and she wanted to let it out. Chapter 2. Lonnie wandered around the castle, looking into each room, asking if anyone had seen her daughter. Finally, she heard someone say that they had seen that Katerina was still in the portrait hall. Walking in that direction, she stepped into the hall and saw her young 16-year-old daughter. She watched her daughter for a few moments, thinking about the other little girl that she gave birth to. That daughter had been stillborn, however, and it had broken her heart seeing that lifeless babe. Even now, seeing Derek twinless hurt more than she could bear sometimes. She shook her head. "Katerina," she called out. When her daughter's blue-gray eyes met hers, she continued, "Your father would like to speak to you in his study." She noticed that her daughter was curious, so she said, "It's something important." Katerina thought about it, wondering what her father could want, and said, "Yes, mother." She followed her mother, and they soon made it through the castle halls to the king's study. Katerina looked at the three men in the study. They all had serious looks on their faces. She frowned. "What is going on?" she thought. Her father cleared his throat and focused his gaze onto his only daughter. He saw the confusion, and he spoke up. "Katerina, I called you here today to tell you about a contract that just came into effect. I have to tell you that if this doesn't go through, we will be held responsible for breaking the contract, and our country could be bankrupt." He sighed. "Back when my grandfather was alive, he set up a contract where his great-granddaughter and the great-grandson of one of two countries would marry to bring peace to the world. He gave her a little bit more information, ignoring her look of horror, but everyone in the room noticed it. The other two royal families in this world have stepped up to offer their eldest sons. They should be here in 1 week and 2 weeks, respectively. You must choose one of the two princes to marry, or we will all suffer." Katerina's face darkened. A storm was brewing inside, and she wanted to let it out. She shakes her head. "Father, I refuse to marry for anything but love. How dare you say that I have to choose between two princes? What was your grandfather thinking, having me married off to the highest bidder?" She wasn't thinking straight, of course. But this was a really big deal. Why did she have to have an arranged marriage? She couldn't believe that her father wanted to force her to marry someone that she didn't love. The king, queen, and the advisors shook their heads at her childish antics. They knew that you don't always get what you want, and that sometimes the best things in life come unexpectedly. They thought that this disagreeableness is why most people don't really like her that much anymore. She really was selfish, and Julius couldn't believe how much she had changed from when she was a little girl. He mourned the old Katerina. He sighed internally at the fact that his baby girl, just 16, had to marry so soon. It seemed only yesterday that she was running around terrorizing the maids with the frogs. Now, here she was, 16 and practically a woman. The dark-haired advisor, Justin, cleared his throat. He didn't like the fact that she was being disrespectful to her father. So he felt he had to speak up. Princess, this marriage contract was signed by your great-grandfather. It's set in stone. You will marry one of the two princes that are coming. If you don't, the country could lose everything and become bankrupt over a broken contract. Then no one would want to do business with us. He took a deep breath and continued. Not to mention, you might actually find love in the arrangement. I certainly did come to love my wife. Blake, the blonde advisor, agreed. Justin's right. You might not believe it right now, but you might fall in love. Just try it. His own marriage was arranged. Also, the king and queen had an arranged marriage. They were all in love with their spouses. Katerina refused to believe that she'd fall in love with anyone that her parents or their advisors chose. She scoffed at the thought of marrying a prince that she didn't even know. Then she ran out of the castle and into the surrounding village. She walked around looking at all the sights. Catching a scent of pumpkin pie and freshly baked bread, Katerina followed her nose to the bakery. When she got there, she said hello to the baker's wife, Julie. Julie asked her, What's wrong, princess? Father wants me to marry a stranger. He said that I have to marry one of two princes that are on their way here right now. I don't want to marry a stranger. The woman also told her that she might fall in love with one of the two princes. You know, my older sister also had an arranged marriage. She married a lord in the next village. She's happily married with 3 living children. Everyone knew that Julie's sister had lost a babe many years before. They saw how depressed Julie became during that time as she helped her sister through that tragedy. Remember that tarot reading I did for you a few years ago? You'll meet a tall, dark-haired stranger and fall in love. Katerina shook her head. Everyone spouted the same information. How could she fall in love with a stranger? Ugh. People keep saying stuff like that. I hate it. She still didn't believe that she'd find love. She walked back to the castle, lost in thought, and her mother reminded her that the 2 princes would be there in a week or 2. She still didn't believe that her country could go bankrupt over the breaking of this contract. She should be able to marry for love, not because her parents wanted her to get married. She ignored everyone that told her to grow up and go through the arranged marriage. Then she hurried through the halls and up the stairs to her room that was filled with canvases, bookcases, embroidery supplies, notebooks, and even a tarot deck on her desk. She walked to her desk and sat in the chair to pull her diary out of the top drawer on the right. She wrote in her diary that everyone was out to get her and that they were trying to force her to marry a complete stranger. She was furious. When she was done writing, she walked over to the easel. A maid peeked her head into the room, but shook her head at the angry look on the princess's face. She knew not to interrupt the princess when she was mad. Not that the princess would ever hit the staff, but it was just better to be safe rather than sorry. She hurried back to her chores down the hall. In other parts of the land, 2 princes got ready to leave. They had each been invited to go to King Julius's land to fulfill a contract that their great-grandparents made. The princes packed their bags and said goodbye to their families, promising to write. They each got on a horse and took off with 1 attendant each. The prince of the country closest to the princess only had to journey for about a week, but the other prince, whose country was on the other side of the first prince's, had to journey for 2 weeks at a kind of fast pace. So the 2 boys traveled to meet the princess that either one would marry. Katerina spent the next week working on her hobbies. She painted, did some cross-stitching, crocheted, and journaled. She barely had time to ride her horse. When she wasn't working on her hobbies, she was going back to etiquette classes and dancing lessons. She found them as boring as usual, but necessary to make her family happy. The things princesses had to do for their family. The dancing instructor once told her that she was a natural when she didn't think too much about the moves. However, his remarks sometimes made her make mistakes more often. So she had to work harder to overcome her shortcomings when it came to dancing. Later that week, Katerina had had enough. She was tired of the etiquette classes, and so she told her mother that she was going for a ride to cool her temper. She walked to her room to change and then hurried out of the castle to the stables. She needed to go for a good long ride. Tacking up her mare, she mounted up and rode her horse into the fields where her father used to take her riding when she was young. The first prince arrives. Katerina was riding her horse through the field by her family's castle when she heard the click-clop of 2 other horses. The sound echoed because of the cobblestone in front of the castle. She turned and saw 2 figures arrive at the castle. They sat on their horses, looking around. She scowled. So the first prince has shown up. She nudged her horse forward and then faster. The horse galloped to the gate of the field and jumped over the gate just as neat as could be. Katerina sat up straight after the jump, feeling calmer already. She loved riding a little fast, but safe, and jumping was always fun. She cantered her horse over to the 2 visitors. One of the guys, obviously a prince with how he looked down at her, said, "Go find someone to help us put our horses away. We've been traveling for a week." He looked down his nose at her. Katerina raised an eyebrow. She noticed a stable hand coming over, and she called his name. When he arrived over by her horse, Katerina dismounted. "Please have their horses taken care of. They're visiting the king." She sneered slightly at the visitors, not liking the way she had been greeted. Didn't they notice that she was female? It's not like she hid her sex. Right away, Your Highness, the stable hand replied, taking the reins from her. He bowed slightly before straightening up again. The two visitors looked at her in surprise. The prince asked, "You're a rather effeminate man, aren't you? And what gives you the right to pretend to be royal? You don't even look like you have the stature for royalty." He looked her up and down. His eyes passed over her chest without seeing any difference. His attendant reached a hand out to him, but he ignored it. Katerina glared at him and reached to unbuckle her helmet. She noticed that the attendant had tried to stop him from insulting her, even if he probably also thought she was a guy. As she unbuckled her helmet, she noticed the grin of the stable hand from the corner of her eye, and then she took her helmet off, letting her hair fall down her back. "You were saying?" she smirked. "I'll see you inside." She turned, not caring that the two visitors were staring at her. She did hear the stable hand snicker as he took her horse to the stables. Walking into the castle, Katerina stormed past a few servants, and they backed away warily. She came across her mother on her way to the shower in her room. "Katerina, what's wrong?" Lonnie asked her daughter. "The first prince has arrived, but he was so rude. He treated me like a servant and like I was a boy." Katerina scowled. Lonnie snorted slightly, but quickly hid her expression. "Oh dear. Well, maybe he just had a rough trip." I'll reserve judgment for now." Brown eyes sparkled with laughter. She noticed the two males walking in and smiled slightly. "Wear a nice dress for dinner tonight," she suggested. She looked into her daughter's eyes. Right now they were blue, but they did change from blue to gray to green and everything in between within those three colors. Blue Eyes looked at her mother. "Yes, Mother." Katerina walked past her mother and walked all the way to her room. She saw that a few different dresses had been laid out on her bed. After a quick shower to wash off the sweat of horseback riding, she stood at the foot of her bed in a robe. She was trying to decide on a dress, but she couldn't decide between a blue dress that was an off-the-shoulder strap design or a purple dress that had long sleeves. "I guess I can wear the blue one next week," she said out loud. Then she got dressed. She had a maid help her with her hair, drying it and braiding it down her back.
Trina, I hate to interrupt, but I just got called in to work 3 to 7. I'm going to let Mom and Dad know, and I got to finish getting ready.
Okay.
In fact, I've got to leave very shortly.
Yeah, same. All right, so I have a little bit left on this chapter, and about 3 more pages after that. The guests and most of the royal family were all in the dining hall, waiting and talking to each other. When a sound came from outside the dining hall, they all turned to the door. Soon, the door opened and Katerina stepped inside. Queen Lonnie and King Julius looked proud of their daughter. Her brothers all smiled at her, and Katerina smiled back. Her purple dress flowed behind her as she walked around the table to sit between the second prince the second Peterson's son, her older brother George, and the third son, her younger brother Thomas. Looking up, she noticed that the two visitors were staring at her in shock. Her eyebrows scrunched together in confusion. Why were they staring at her? She turned to look at George and Frederick, the oldest brother, and silently pleaded with them to help her. Apparently Frederick understood her look, because he turned and glared towards the visitors. Please stop staring at my sister. Can't you tell that it makes her uncomfortable? George glared at the visitors too, but didn't say anything. He was a very quiet person. The prince looked away, but his eyes moved back to the princess. The prince's attendant blushed and looked at the oldest prince of the Peterson royal family. Sorry, he replied. Frederick nodded abruptly to the attendant, but noticed that the visiting prince was looking at his sister again with that weird look on his face. But the visiting prince looked away again before Frederick could say anything. Frederick looked at his father and noticed that the king was subtly smiling at him in approval. Frederick felt better after having protected his sister, even just a little bit. Katerina relaxed. With no one staring at her, she was able to focus on the food that after her father started eating. She spoke with her mother and the little brothers, trying to avoid talking to the first visiting prince. So, you are the Prince of Nanari? Julius asked. Yes, Your Majesty, he replied. I'm Eduardo. It's a pleasure to meet you. Nice to meet you, Prince Eduardo. King Julius nodded to the young prince. He knew that the prince was a little too full of himself, but thought that the prince would act more natural as the days went on. Julius hoped that his daughter would at least like one of the two princes. Julius tried to get Prince Eduardo interested in his daughter the right way. Katerina was still trying her hardest to ignore Eduardo, and she even managed to have a wonderful conversation with her mother. They were speaking about the future and what they thought the other prince might be like, which Katerina tried her hardest to avoid as well. Katerina looked away and saw her younger brothers playing at the table. She smiled at Thomas, Derek, and Blake. She always smiled sadly at Derek, even when she was normally happy, because Derek would still sometimes look around for his missing sibling. He had been told when he was 7 that he used to have a twin, and now, 4 years later, he still felt the emptiness in his soul. Katerina decided that, even though she was stressed and a bit aggravated, that she even had to be in the same room as a potential husband. She would try to join in on the fun with her little brothers. They used to have so many fun times together. All right, I am 3 short paragraphs away from the end of this chapter, but I have to go. I'm writing with her. She is working today, and I am going to meet someone. I put this page sideways where my place is, so I am super sorry. I wish I could be here longer, but I have to go. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Sorry. Bye.